The stock was climbing. The parking lots were full. Walk through the headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut in the mid-1990s, and you would have felt it, a kind of institutional confidence that only comes from decades of being right. Xerox had built the modern office. Its name had become a verb. When the company reported earnings, analysts nodded. When it spoke, the market listened. Then, in the space of 3 years, nearly $50 billion in market value disappeared. The stock fell more than 90%. Federal regulators opened an investigation into accounting fraud. The CEO resigned, and an entire generation of employees watched a company they had given their careers to come apart, not in a sudden crash, but in the slow, grinding way that is somehow harder to watch. This is the story of how that happened, not because the people were foolish, not because the warning signs were invisible, but because success itself can be the most dangerous thing a company ever achieves. It began, as so many American stories do, with a problem nobody else wanted to solve. In 1938, a patent attorney named Chester Carlson invented a process he called electrophotography, a way of transferring images onto paper using static electricity and dry ink. He spent the next decade trying to sell the idea. IBM passed, General Electric passed, the US Army passed, 20 companies in total declined. A small photographic paper company called Haloid finally saw what everyone else had missed. They licensed Carlson's technology, renamed the process xerography, from the Greek for dry writing, and in 1959 introduced the Xerox 914, the world's first plain paper photocopier. The machine weighed 400 pounds and cost the equivalent of more than $100,000 in today's money, so Haloid, which had by then renamed itself Xerox, offered to lease it instead. The decision was transformative. Within 3 years, the 914 had generated more revenue than the company had seen in its entire prior history. By the late 1960s, Xerox controlled 80% of the global copier market. Its stock rose 40-fold in a decade. Fortune called it one of the most successful companies in American history. Employees didn't just work at Xerox, they believed in it. The company offered generous benefits, strong internal promotion, and a culture built on technical excellence and institutional pride. In Rochester, New York, where Xerox had deep roots, the company was woven into the fabric of the city. Entire neighborhoods had been built, schools funded, and careers defined by the health of that one organization. This is what makes what followed so difficult, not just economically, but humanly. The people who built Xerox were not complacent. They were, by any reasonable measure, among the most capable and innovative people in American industry, and that, paradoxically, is precisely where the trap was set. In 1970, Xerox opened the Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, in California. It was, by design, kept at a deliberate distance from corporate headquarters, both physically and culturally. The researchers there were given unusual latitude. They were encouraged to pursue ideas that had no immediate commercial application, to think in decades rather than quarters. What emerged from that freedom was extraordinary. By the mid-1970s, PARC had developed the graphical user interface, windows, icons, a desktop metaphor that organized information visually. They had built the mouse. They had created Ethernet, the networking protocol that would eventually connect the world. They had prototyped the laser printer. They had, in effect, invented the modern personal computer years before anyone else knew that such a thing was coming. In 1979, a young entrepreneur named Steve Jobs arranged a visit to PARC. He was 24 years old, and Apple was growing quickly, but he was looking for the next thing. Xerox, in exchange for an agreement to purchase Apple stock at a favorable price, agreed to show him what they had. Jobs walked through the demonstration of the Alto, PARC's prototype computer with its graphical interface and mouse, and understood immediately what he was seeing. By his own account, he thought Xerox was sitting on technology that could change the world, and he could not understand why they weren't doing anything with it. What Jobs saw as negligence was, from inside Xerox, something more complicated than that. The men who ran Xerox's commercial divisions had a perfectly rational response to PARC's inventions. They were not copier technology. The company's entire infrastructure, Its manufacturing, its sales force, its leasing model, its service network was built around copiers, the people who understood that business had spent careers learning it. Their incentive structures rewarded copier revenue, copier margins, and copier market share. When PARC's researchers brought personal computing concepts to corporate attention, the response was not dismissal exactly. It was something more structural, a genuine difficulty in seeing how these ideas mapped onto what Xerox understood itself to be. There were internal advocates, engineers and researchers who wrote memos, made presentations, argued that Xerox needed to move into personal computing before the window closed. Some of those arguments reached senior leadership, and the leadership, in at least some cases, listened and then returned to the thing they knew how to do. The copier business was real. The personal computing business was theoretical. Quarterly results were immediate. The future was not. This is not a story of villains. It is a story of intelligent people reasoning correctly within a framework that was itself the problem. The competitors, meanwhile, were not waiting. Japanese manufacturers, Canon, Ricoh, Minolta, had spent the 1970s studying Xerox the way Xerox had once studied its own market. They understood the machine, they reduced the costs, and critically, they targeted the segment of the market that Xerox had not bothered to defend, small and medium businesses that didn't need a £400 enterprise copier but could use something cheaper, faster, and easier to maintain. Between 1976 and 1982, Xerox's share of the global copier market fell from roughly 80% to under 50%. Not because Xerox had stopped making good machines, but because the market had grown into territory Xerox wasn't watching. The company's response was vigorous and, in some respects, impressive. In the early 1980s, Xerox launched a quality initiative that became genuinely influential in American manufacturing. It brought costs down. It improved reliability. It won back some ground from the Japanese competition. For a period, it seemed as though the company had absorbed the lesson and corrected course. But the larger strategic challenge, the one Jobs had intuited in that PARC demo room, was still unresolved. The personal computer was becoming real. Apple was selling it. IBM had entered the market. Microsoft was writing the operating system. And Xerox was watching from the outside, having given away the foundational technology for a relatively modest equity stake. In 1981, Xerox did release a personal computer, the Star, built on PARC technology, with a graphical interface and a mouse, years before the Macintosh. It was technically accomplished and priced at approximately $16,000 per unit. It sold poorly. The company did not follow it with a sustained commitment to the consumer computing market. Instead, it continued to position itself as an enterprise solutions company, which was not wrong exactly, but was increasingly insufficient. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Xerox made a series of strategic decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation. It invested heavily in its services division. It pursued acquisitions. It expanded into financial services, a move that eventually required a partial divestiture and significant write-downs. Each decision was made by experienced executives working with real data and genuine analysis. And each decision moved the company slightly further from the core technical advantages it had once held. By the late 1990s, the document management market itself was transforming. Email was reducing the volume of printed material. Digital workflows were replacing paper ones. The very problem Xerox had been built to solve, the reproduction and distribution of documents, was being solved differently by software, by networks, by the internet. Xerox's revenue, which had grown steadily for decades, began to plateau. And then, in 1997 and 1998, it began to fall. The company brought in new leadership. Restructuring plans were announced. Costs were cut. Thousands of employees were laid off, first in smaller waves, then in larger ones. In 1998, Xerox cut 14,000 jobs. In 2000, it cut another 4,000. The stock, which had traded above $60 in 1999, fell below $4 by 2001. Analysts who had held it as a blue-chip investment were explaining to clients how they had not seen it coming. That year, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into Xerox's accounting practices. The company had been recording revenue improperly on equipment leases, inflating earnings by approximately $6 billion over a 5-year period. Xerox eventually settled, paying a fine and restating its financials. Several senior executives were named in the action. The investigation did not cause Xerox's decline, but it crystallized what that decline had come to mean. This was not a company navigating a difficult transition with grace. This was an institution under pressure making choices that eroded the trust on which its relationships with investors, customers, and employees ultimately rested. In the summer of 2000, Xerox's newly appointed chief executive, Anne Mulcahy, was told by advisors that the company should consider filing for bankruptcy. She declined. What followed was one of the more remarkable corporate turnarounds of the early 2000s. She reduced debt, sold assets, refocused operations, and returned the company to profitability. It was, by any measure, a serious achievement, but it was a turnaround from near collapse, not a return to dominance. The company that emerged was smaller, more focused, and structurally sound, but it was no longer the company that had defined the modern office. The verb to Xerox remained in the language, but the thing it described was increasingly done by multifunctional devices made by competitors or not done at all. In 2010, Xerox acquired Affiliated Computer Services for $6 billion, pivoting toward business process outsourcing. In 2016, the company split itself in two. In 2018, a proposed merger with Fujifilm fell apart under pressure from activist investors. The company that Chester Carlson's technology had built, the company that had once controlled the way information moved through the offices of the world, was, by then, a mid-sized technology services firm navigating a market it no longer led. The employees who had spent their careers there, the communities that had grown around its campuses, the investors who had held its stock through what seemed like an interminable golden era, they all carried versions of the same question. How does this happen? The easy answer is that Xerox failed to innovate, but that answer is not just incomplete, it is wrong in the specific way that makes it useless. Xerox innovated constantly. PARC was producing breakthroughs throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. The company's engineers were among the best in the world. The problem was not the absence of innovation. The problem was the relationship between innovation and power. Inside a successful organization, the people who control resource allocation are, almost by definition, the people who mastered the existing business. They understand what made the company successful. They are rewarded, implicitly and explicitly, for protecting and extending that success. When a new technology arrives, one that does not fit the existing model, the honest evaluation they make is not, is this the future? It is, does this serve the business I have built? Those are different questions, and the second one almost always produces the answer that preserves the status quo. This is not a flaw in judgment. It is a structural feature of how authority is organized inside institutions. The people best positioned to recognize transformative change are rarely the same people with the authority to act on it. PARC's researchers saw the future clearly. The executives who controlled Xerox's commercial strategy were not ignoring them out of arrogance. They were applying rational calculus to a business they understood and reaching conclusions that were defensible given the information and incentives they had. What Xerox's story reveals, and what makes it transferable to almost any large organization today, is that the greatest risk a successful company faces is not a competitor it can see. It is the gap between where the future is being built and where the decisions about investment and strategy are actually being made. That gap had a name at Xerox. It was called PARC. And for a decade, it produced wonders that the company looked at, measured against its existing business, and set aside. Xerox still exists. It employs thousands of people, prints billions of documents annually through its technology, and trades on the New York Stock Exchange. It is not a failure in the ordinary sense. It is something more instructive, a company that held the future in its hands, understood it well enough to name it, and then watched someone else build it. The last Xerox Alto, the machine that contained everything Jobs saw in that 1979 demonstration, sits in a museum now. It works. You can still move a mouse across a screen and watch Windows open. It is, in every technical sense, the ancestor of the device you are reading this on. Chester Carlson spent a decade being told his invention was worthless. He died in 1968, a year before PARC opened, wealthy beyond anything he had imagined, having watched his idea change the world. He never had to watch what came next. That distinction, perhaps, was its own kind of fortune.